Judges then. Let's turn to the book of Judges. And what I'd like to do is the usual thing, okay? So we've all got the idea now. We take a look initially at the structure of a book, and then we'll select different passages perhaps, or different characters to look at in more detail. And we indicated yesterday, I think, that we're going to take a look at Gideon, but we may also look at one or two others, see how the time goes. So the book of Judges then is in between the period of coming into Canaan and settling the land with Joshua, and then the establishing of the monarchy through Samuel and with Saul. So it's an in-between period. And the book itself is very much in favor of the idea of monarchy. So in one sense, Judges is a, shall we say, polemic, or it's an argument in favor of the idea of monarchy. It shows, the book of Judges shows what life is like without a king. So it's an apologetic for the notion of monarchy. If we want a word to sum up a book, then the word that we've always used, and people do it everywhere, to sum up the book of Judges is the idea of a circle or a cycle. And very much so, that the book tells a story that goes round and round and round during its pages. So the cyclical pattern is like this. The nation of Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord. That's where the cycle begins. And then, as a result, God gives the people of Israel over in judgment to an enemy. So different enemies will oppress the Israelites or have victory over the Israelites. And that's God's judgment on them for the fact they've done evil in his sight. Then, as the cycle turns, the people of Israel cry out to God for help. Very reminiscent of the Israelites in Egypt, when they cried out to God for a deliverer and God sent Moses. The people cry out to him. And God hears their cries, and then God gives them a ruler. And so that the cycle starts to go upwards. They now have a ruler, and that ruler is known as a judge, hence the title of the book of Judges. That judge is then endowed with the Spirit of Yahweh, the Spirit of God, to rule. And that ruler gives the people victory. And then they reach the top of the cycle. They have victory, they have peace. During the reign of that judge, whether it's 40 years or however long it is, the nation has peace and rest. That's one cycle. When the judge dies, then the Israelites again start to do evil in the sight of God. They then go downward. They're given over in judgment. They then cry out to God when they're at the bottom of that cycle. God sends a ruler. The ruler gives them victory, and they reach the top again. And round we go like this in the book of Judges. It's cyclical. And when it comes to the judges, we have 6 major judges, big figures. And then we have 6 minor judges. So for the sake of time, then, I won't mention the minor judges. I'm sure you can look up those for yourselves. Let's look at the 6 major judges. And some very familiar characters amongst the judges. We have in chapter 3, the first, Othniel. He's the first of the judges. A bit of a short story is given over to Othniel. And also in chapter 3, we have the second judge, Ehud. Again, a bit of a short story, not as short as the first judge. And then we get Deborah. Now, Deborah is considered by many to be the greatest female character in the Bible. Most other female characters are discussed in relation to their husbands. So we know who their husband is, the role that the husband does, the importance of the husband. Deborah's husband gets a mention, he's named, but that's it. The entire focus is on Deborah, and Deborah is a judge, a ruler. She's also a legal character, so she makes judgments between people and settles disputes. She's a prophetess, she foresees future events, and she goes to battle. So she's a hugely significant character. And as I said at the start, if we have enough time, we may come back and look a little bit further at this woman, Deborah. She's the third of the judges. Then we get Gideon in chapters 6 to 8. So Deborah's chapters 4 to 5. Gideon is then chapters 6 to 8. We look at him in a minute. We then have Jephthah, who's judge number 5. He's chapters 11 into 12. And then, of course, the final judge is that very strange fellow, Samson. And he's chapters 13 through to 16. And each of the judges, including Deborah, but in a kind of lesser way, each of the judges is a flawed character. They have obvious weaknesses. And that's the whole point. God is choosing the weak and the foolish things to lead his people Israel. And it's very much the case that Samson, out of all the judges, is the ultimate weak character with obvious character flaws. And many years ago in our fellowship, we studied Samson, and some of you may remember. And it's a very great challenge to look at Samson and to do so honestly, because Samson's weakness is in a very human area and one that we often find uncomfortable to talk about. So he's the last of the judges. And then the book ends with some very strange stories. And it's like a sort of combination of stories. And the final chapters of the book of Judges have one purpose, and that's to show the need for a king. So as the book of Judges closes, society is falling apart. Society throughout the book has never functioned well, but towards the end of the book, things get worse and worse and worse. And there's this huge spiritual, moral collapse in Israel society amongst the people of God. And right at the end of the book, you have this terrible story of the city of Gibeah in Benjamin. And if you just take a look for a moment, let's do that, shall we? Look at the end of the book of Judges and chapter 19. And going into chapter 20, and you have this story that is almost identical to the story of Lot and Sodom. You have the idea of a man journeying. He tells us where he's journeying from, and he has to spend the night in the city of Gibeah. He chooses to spend the night there. The city belongs to the tribe of Benjamin. He's there with his concubine or whoever she is, and he spends the night there. And as he's there, the men of the town come banging on the door, just like the men of Sodom does, and they want to know this woman. They want her to be handed over to them. It's just so reminiscent of Sodom and the days of Lot. So just take a look at chapter 19 of the book of Judges, and we'll pick the story up in verse 22. As they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him carnally." Now, this old man has given refuge to the travelers in his house, and he's protecting them. Verse 23, but the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. This man has come to my house. Do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter." And the man's concubine, and he hands them over. Now, can you see that's exactly the story of Sodom with Lot? And the whole purpose of this is to show that by the end of the book of Judges, the condition of the people of God is exactly like the condition that was true of Sodom all those years earlier. God's people have declined to the lowest point imaginable spiritually and in relation to the covenant that they have with God. And of course, this book is all about the covenant. Do you remember the covenant that God has established through Moses has the condition? And the condition is the people of God must obey his laws, keep his word, be faithful to him, forsake all other gods. That's the condition for the continuing blessing of God upon them. And of course, the whole purpose of the book of Judges is that the Israelites are breaking that covenant obligation again and again and again. So the covenant remains important for the book of Judges itself. Okay, so before we look at any character, there are two statements that are going to be repeated throughout the book that are key statements, and most people would link those statements to the book of Judges. And the first of the statements is, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Now, do you remember this book is an apology for, it's a polemic. They want a king. So just take a look at some of the chapters. 17 and verse 6. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Take a look at chapter 18 and verse 1. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Go across to chapter 19 and verse 1. There was no king in Israel. Chapter 21 and verse 25, I think, which is the very last verse of the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. So do you see the idea there? The message that's being repeated, the condition of Israel is because in those days, there was no king in Israel. And then, of course, the other statement that's very famously linked to the book of Judges is the statement, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So chapter 17 and verse 6, you see it there. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And then the book ends with both of those statements put together. Very last verse, 21 and verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So the book ends there. And now we are ready now. Okay, then. There needs to be a king. And the book has set us up with an expectation that the solution to the terrible spiritual conditions, the moral collapse, the chaos that is in society, is the fact that we need a king. We then get the book of Ruth, which is a pause, a big deep breath, and then we go into Samuel. And of course, Samuel is where the monarchy is established. So that's the structure of the book of Judges. We can talk a little bit about Deborah, and then we'll have a look at Gideon. But can I also say that there's another figure, a major figure that we've missed out, who's not a judge, and in fact, he is the first king of Israel. We always think of Saul as the first king of Israel, but in fact, we find the first king in the book of Judges. And this chap is Abimelech. And Abimelech is the first actual king. So in chapter 9, we have the story of Abimelech. And Abimelech is Gideon's son. And in fact, Gideon had 70 sons, or 71, I suppose. And this fellow Abimelech kills all his brothers, apart from one, I think, and he becomes king. So if you look at chapter 9, and we start at verse 6, okay? Chapter 9 and verse 6. The men of Shechem, and that's where the covenant was re-established in the book of Joshua. All the men of Shechem gathered together, all of Beth Milo, and they went and made Abimelech king beside the terebinth tree at the pillar that was in Shechem. So here's your first king of Israel, Abimelech. And as you go down into chapter 9, you get the fact that he's king reinforced a few times. So look at verse 16. And here's the prophet speaking. Now, therefore, if you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal, that's Gideon and his house, and you have done to him as he deserves, you know, if you've done the right thing here, then, says this man of God, in making Abimelech king. But of course they haven't, because this man is a murderer, and he's bloodthirsty, and in fact, he turns against, by killing his brothers, he turns against the people of God. So it's a sort of civil war that's actually going on here under this man. Verse 22, after Abimelech had reigned over Israel 3 years. Verse 23, God sends a spirit of ill will between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. Here's a civil war starting as God moves against this man who is this first king of Israel. And as you see from verse 7, we get a parable of the trees, in which we got the idea of the people of God wanting a king. And they ask different trees, the olive tree and the fig tree and the vine, and they end up with the bramble. The bramble then is going to be the king. Verse 14. Then all the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, so on, so on. So Abimelech is being compared to a bramble. And the people of God in this man have a worthless, thorny, prickly, hurting king to rule over them. And of course, by the end of chapter 9, I think, that's the end of Abimelech. He gets crushed to death by a falling stone, I think, that crushes his skull. If you look at the end of chapter 9, verse 52, he's sieging a tower in which his enemies have taken refuge, 52. So Abimelech came as far as the tower and fought against it. And he drew near the door of the tower to burn it with fire. But a certain woman dropped an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, draw your sword and kill me, lest men say of me, a woman killed me. So his young man thrust him through and he died. There's echoes of Saul there in the armor bearer role. So there's your first king of Israel, Abimelech. And even though he's such a disaster, the book is still this declaration that Israel needs a king. So let's look at Deborah. And we find the story of Deborah in chapters 4 and 5. And look at how she's introduced in Judges and chapter 4. Let's look at verse 4. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. Now that's just amazing, isn't it? And she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. So can you see, as well as a leader and a ruler, she is an actual judge. She is making what's called jurisprudence, judgments of the law, in order to resolve disputes between the people of God. And she summons Barak to be the captain of her armies, sends him off to war, but he won't go unless she goes with him. Verse 8, Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. So here's the man in charge of the army saying that unless he has the presence of this woman, he refuses to go and engage in battle. Now, can I ask you to think about something here? Verse 8, what does it remind you of? The form of words there, the structure of the verse. If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. That's a very deliberate structure that looks back to a character who said something very similar, and it looks forward to a character who's going to say something very similar. And so Barak and Deborah are put in a context that is meant to remind you of a hugely significant moment in the past and a hugely significant moment that's to come. But at least it's to come in terms of the books of the Bible. I don't mean chronologically. So look at verse 9. Judges 4 and verse 9. So she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Now, Sisera is the leader of the enemy. He's the general in charge of the army of the enemy. And what Deborah prophesies here is that Sisera will be killed, but not by Barak. And in fact, Sisera is going to be killed by a woman. And that's her prophecy in verse 9. And as you go down through the chapter, in fact, you've got that very famous story of the battle. And Sisera loses the battle. He runs for his life. He comes across Jael and her tent, and he goes into her tent. She gives him shelter. She gives him milk. She reassures him. She gets him to sleep. He feels safe. And then she drives a tent peg through his head and nails him to the ground and kills him. Jael, the woman, has had victory over Sisera. And in chapter 5, you get the Song of Deborah, as Deborah celebrates the great victory that God has given. And this song is amongst the earliest of all the Old Testament songs. And it became hugely important in the life of Israel, the Song of Deborah. And again, as you think of the Song of Deborah in chapter 5, it looks back to an earlier song, and it points forward to future songs that women are going to sing. And the song looks back and forward in exactly the same way as verse 8. If you go, I will go. If you don't go, I won't go. That looks back and forward. And so the song and that verse both function in the same way as to remind us of something and to prepare us for something. And in the Song of Deborah, you get the most tragic image that, one of the most tragic images that you find in our entire Bibles. If you look down the song, so we're in chapter 5, look down to verse 28. And Deborah in the song is imagining Sisera's mother. And she is in the house back home, looking through the window, and she's waiting for Sisera to come back from battle. And if you read that verse, it's really poignant and tragic. Verse 28. The mother of Sisera looked through the window and cried out through the lattice work, why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarries the clatter of his chariots? And her wisest ladies answered her, yes, she even understood for herself. Are they not finding and dividing the spoil, to every man a girl or two? For Sisera, plunder of dyed garments, plunder of garments embroidered and dyed, 2 pieces of dyed embroidery for the neck. They say to each other, oh, look, why are they late? Why is he late coming back from the battle? Oh, I know. He's dividing the spoil. He's celebrating his victories. He's making himself rich. Well, of course, he's dead. And Deborah is almost rejoicing in the idea that Sisera's mother doesn't know that her son has died. And she's in for this most terrible shock when the news reaches. So it's a terribly tragic picture, but also very moving. So Deborah, one of the great characters, in fact, as I say, many people think the greatest female character that you find in our Bibles. Okay, so time's going quickly. Let's have a look at Gideon. So Gideon then, chapter 6, and we go into, do we go into chapter 7? Yes, and chapter 8. Okay, so Gideon, one of the judges, and Gideon, his weakness is that he's timid. He's a bit like Timothy, I suppose, in the New Testament. But the reason for looking at Gideon is to deal with this whole matter of the fleece that he puts out. We all know the story, and it's there in chapter 6. So let's just read the story of Gideon and the fleece for a moment. So Gideon said to God, verse 36, and it's very interesting that we have the term God, A-L. So Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And so God does it. And then verse 39, do not be angry with me, he says to God, but let me speak just once more. Let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, but on the ground let there be dew. So Gideon inverts the condition that he's putting forward. Now, we all know, don't we, that Christians, when they don't know what to do, when they are uncertain about what decision to make, will put out a fleece. That's the phrase that we hear time and time again. And it's put out, so we are told, in order to determine what the will of God is at any one moment, what God wants a Christian to do in certain circumstances, what decision that God wants a person to make. We call it, don't we? It's even become a phrase, or we put a fleece out in order to get a sense of God's will and purpose. Is there any surprise to you if I say that that's not what this passage is about at all? It's not guidance. It's God accommodating himself to Gideon's weakness. We said that all these characters, all the judges are weak, and Gideon is timid. He's not a war hero. He's not a brave and strong man. He's not a natural leader. He's tremendously timid. And he can't believe that God would have chosen someone like him to be ruler over Israel. And so he needs assurance. And that's this whole notion of the fleece. It's nothing at all to do with guidance. And if I can say very gently that you and I, as God's people, if we want to make decisions, we don't need to do anything at all in terms of what we would call putting out a fleece. None of us have got a fleece, have we? And none of us have ever stuck an actual sheep's fleece out onto the ground and asked God to keep it dry or to make it wet. It's just not something we can do. We often hear missionaries talking about, don't they? Oh, they put a fleece out and so on. Can I just respectfully suggest that that's not at all what's going on here? And it's not at all what we ought to do as God's people. It sounds great. It sounds impressive. It has a sort of sense of spirituality about it when we use that phrase, putting out a fleece. But it's completely mistaken to do so. And of course, it raises the question about guidance. What do Christians do then? What should we do if we want guidance? I want to end with this. And I want to kind of head towards the New Testament, but I want to head towards the New Testament, but kind of skirt Proverbs and chapter 3 and verse 6. So just a very sort of quick nod in the directions of Proverbs first. So if you've got your Bibles there, turn to Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 5 rather. Proverbs 3 and verse 5, because this particular proverb, this maxim, is also often taken to do with guidance. And I'm going to say, and we'll perhaps look at it in more detail when we come to the book of Proverbs, that again, this is not, in spite of its common usage amongst Christian people, it is not about guidance. So Proverbs 3 verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he shall direct your paths. People say, don't they, oh, I had to make a decision. I was faced with this big life thing that I needed to know about. So I didn't lean to my own understanding. And I had to acknowledge God and trust in him. And I couldn't think and I mustn't make up. Well, you know, that's not what this is all about, guys. No surprise there, you might say. But just in passing, we'll come to it again. That's not about guidance either. For us as Christian people, if we are thinking about decisions we need to make, choices, what do we do, what's the right thing, where does guidance come from then? Well, let's end in Romans, and Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. And these are very well-known verses, but these are the verses we look to when we want to understand the nature of how a Christian knows the will of God for him or for her as we lead our lives. Romans 12, 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your true worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may know what is the good, the acceptable, and the perfect will of God. So how do you know the will of God? You know the will of God as a result of transforming your mind, not being conformed to this world, but through a metamorphosis of your own mind. Guidance, the right decision we need to make, the right choice in our lives, comes from inside of us. It doesn't come from outside by some sign or by us abdicating our responsibility to think. Guidance comes from inside of us, from having a renewed mind. And it's that new mind that enables us to know, to test, to prove, verse 2, what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. What does God want me to do? I know that because my mind has been transformed. My mind has been renewed. And so if I could sum it up like this, the babies in the Old Testament, and that's what they were, the whole Old Testament dispensation is for babies. Their guidance came from outside. Their directions were external, the law, the priest, the commandment. You move into the New Testament, and we are now grown up, we are adults. Guidance is internal. There is no external rule. There is no external voice. It is the Holy Spirit who lives within us. It is the inner mind, the renewing of that mind, that becomes the location for guidance for the Christian. So I've told a lie. I said Romans was the last thing we look at. Let's look at actually 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13, one of the things it does, it tells us that the Old Testament was when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But then verse 11, now I become a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, that's the New Testament before the scriptures, but then I shall know just as I am known. So the great characteristic of Christian life is all the externals have gone. and it's the new man, and it's the new mind, and it's the Holy Spirit who lives in me. The book of Judges.